that we watch, and we thank God that we're not in Ferguson or Baltimore or Charleston. We sit back and we watch, and we may even thank God that we haven't been on street corners in New York. Or perhaps we sit back and we watch and we talk about that which is going on as if it is truly news. But in today's reality, in today's society, in the communities that often go untalked about, that often are invisible, we recognize that that which is being lived is that which has gone on for many years. It is the true lived reality of men and women whose systems of violence and exploitation have often left them out of an economy that is supposed to be for them all. Truly, it has been the lived reality of them, and now it is on, as some would say, Front Street, and we have to do something about it. It is right in the midst of everything that we do. And so then when we elected President Obama, or they elected, or whoever elected, and we felt so good because it meant for some of us that we had triumphed against racism and against the history that is truly in the heartbeat of this country of ours. We felt so good because it meant something. It said to us that now there is someone in this authoritarian position who may not necessarily look like the ones who enslaved people. But looks like those that were enslaved. We felt so good because we thought that it meant that we were doing something. But as years go by, we're faced with the reality that that which may be an elected position is not truly that which may be one that is of power and true authority. What other president, if you will, have we seen and do we know of that has had foreign dignitaries be invited over without their consent or without checking in? What other president have we had? Or what other time in our lives have we seen an environment where we ourselves, as those that lived in these United States, have to be faced with the hostility of what it means to be of color and black in America, and to confront the fact that racism really has nothing to do with whether or not you call me nigger, but has that to do with whether or not your systems truly are open and accessible to me and those that are not white. So Amir, this young Muslim brother, speaks of being a dead man walking, a mute man talking, a blind man watching his brothers die. And he says that he is not going to build any more coffins. That though there's a feeling of hopelessness, that he himself is going to actualize that which is his own mind and his own passion, and even that which some may consider dangerous within him, but to enact it in such a way that he is a part of a system to transform it so that truly all could be at the table. Even as some of you may be wondering, well, what did he say? He was talking so fast. What did he say? I couldn't hear him. But perhaps that's the treadmill that we're on. Because we have young people that are feeling something that we ourselves cannot often identify with. Mm-hmm. But when I hear him speak in such a manner, I began to remember the eyes and the face of that older member that I had as I pastored in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. The person who was an older male, who him and his wife had welcomed back children into their home, children who at one point in their lives they thought would get great jobs and they would be the ones then that could buy homes and do better than their generation, and they would leave their house and never come back. But this young man, I would say, although he was probably around 65, 70 or so, welcomed these children back. And not only did he welcome the children, he welcomed back the grandchildren. And they found themselves with about 5 people in the home, with only 2 of them working. And even the 2 of them working jobs that did not pay a livable wage and jobs that were not full-time, but yet and still they were working, and they celebrated that. And he would come to church and he would try to make sure that he held his head up high, but in his eyes, and as you looked in his very spirit, you knew that there was something else going on. And perhaps because he also was the administrative assistant to our church, and I had the honor of sharing an office with them. Some of you know about small churches, and you do what you have to do. And he and I would have exchanges, and I knew that there was a level in which he just did not let me completely in. So when I hear Amir, I think about him. And I think about that one day, after I had preached for so long, after we had multiple exchanges, after I visited with him and his wife and his children, and even gone to meetings for his grandchildren and their football games and basketball games. And suddenly there was this moment in a Wendy's when we were just drinking some fruit punch, where he began to open up about his feeling of being a dead man walking. He began to open up about his feelings of being invisible. He began to open up about what it's truly like to be a male in a Southern culture in which you very well may have that traditional mindset, but yet know that you cannot provide for your family. To being the one that has to get up and pack a lunch and go to a job where there may be those on the job that are so much younger than him, and yet even as he begins to bring his check back home, the check is not even enough to feed 3 of the 5 that are in the house. He talked about how he at one point had one of those good textile jobs in North Carolina, but the time in which NAFTA began to be enacted and all of those jobs dried up and he was laid off. And he just knew that since he was such a hard worker that eventually something would come back open for him. And truly this economy of North Carolina was such that it could incorporate and it could embrace him. But it never came. So when I hear Amir talking about this dead man walking, I think about his eyes. I think about that exchange in that Wendy's. And I think about the invisibility that he expressed to me. I think about that in light of the recent stop of the fast-track trade policy yesterday. And I hear conversations with United Methodist pastors and United Methodist theologians that I knew were trying to organize, and we were helping them to find ways in which to tell the story of how in other states trade policies may not have worked out quite like people thought that they would. And yet the people begin to be marginalized and put in the background. I think about him and his connection to all of that. And even how the North Carolina Council of Churches had to step up and hear the cries of all faith communities and how they provided care for the least among them because they did not have these jobs that they had for 20 years, but yet and still They were experiencing a pain and a grief and an anguish unlike anything else. And so the council had to begin to develop new tools for pastors and clergy of all faiths about how to deal with suicide, about how to deal with the 60-year-old that thought that they were right at the edge of retiring, but the job went away. Dead men walking, mute men and women talking, blind men and women watching their brothers die. It's interesting because as we look today here in Rhode Island, another way of seeing this whole phenomenon is beginning to look at the dreams of the left behind. What happens to a dream deferred, Langston Hughes talks about. Does it just fester? Does it just froth up? Or does it merely explode? What happens to the dreams of these vulnerable communities? It's easy for us as progressives to rest on our laurels and talk so much about the gains that we've made. But in actuality, at most of our progressive tables, the invisible people of which I speak, those people of color communities that are the highest number of poverty rates here in Rhode Island as well as in the U.S. in general, are not even at the tables that we set to lobby for them themselves. We are lobbying for people who are not a part of their own empowerment, and we've gotten so settled with it all. We've gotten so okay with it all that we don't even expect them to be there. We're just really glad that we are the ones that are going forth and raising our voices, no matter how paternalistic it seems to be.
Wow.
It's an interesting thing. As we see the young people in Ferguson, as we see the shirts that read, "I can't breathe," as we see Baltimore even erupting in violence and young folk that are so angry, we see the people who themselves have not been a part of the solutions, not necessarily because they didn't want to be, but because they've been locked out of institutions and systems of power and in an education system in which you are not allowed to analyze systems and power and know what systems and power are. You don't necessarily know what to do with your anger except but to explode. But we could progressive sit back and we look and we advocate, and that's great. And we come to the table, and that's great. But people of faith, we come to the table that is not set correctly, nor do we come to the table with an agenda that is inclusive of everyone. We can't talk about growing an economy for all if all are not at the table to even talk about how the economy is disproportionately affecting them. There are numbers, but yet and still there's also the lived reality and experience of people. And so how then do we begin to set a different table? How then do we begin to empower communities and work truly with people to begin to tackle the disproportionate outcomes as it relates to race in Rhode Island and in these United States? There's a movement in North Carolina that has taken hold in Alabama and taken hold in New York. A movement in which people come together across different barriers and they speak truth to power together, but they don't do it in such a way that one group leads another. They do it in such a way that all have already gotten to the table and set a policy agenda. That they don't come Johnny or Susie come lately, but all are there in the beginning. It's called the More Monday Forward Together movement. And it makes sure that no matter where you are, be you undocumented or documented, be you English speaking or not English speaking, be you gay or lesbian, be you Jewish, be you Buddhist, no matter where you are, be you atheist, there is an inherent worth and dignity as a human being that is respected when we talk about health care, when we talk about living wage, when we talk about truly having children that don't go hungry. And not only is that human dignity expected, but there's a place at the table for all of those people. But one of the things that I would suggest to you even today, that even as that place is set in such a way that folks realize that it's not an easy process. One, they have to make visible that which is invisible. The statistics about the disproportionate rates of poverty in the Native American community here, in the Latino community, as well as the African American community, is not something that is talked about only on the outside, but it's talked about as it relates to the lived reality of people that are on the inside. They make visible the invisible. There is not a way in which people are scared to talk about race and racism, and scared to talk about even ways that progressive tables tend to be set up in such a way that we keep getting the same old white folk that have been good people in the Interfaith and the Ecumenical movement all of these years, but we don't make space for young people and their passions and their hurts and their new ways of doing things. It makes visible the invisible in such a way that we're not scared to have those hard conversations in which we actually have to change and do something different.
Wow.
It says to people that though there may be differences, that we will not be fearful of those differences. And I'm sure when we are not fearful, it does mean that we have to do something different. It means that we have to change. I'll make it live for you like this. For me, a Southern female going to pastor a church in Western Pennsylvania, in Butler, Pennsylvania, the honey culture was something that was new to me. I did not readily know it. And quite honestly, at the time, I really didn't respect it. I thought of it as something that was an NRA type thing. A way in which it shows how we are so violent as a society. But I got into a church that loved to serve deer meat, that loved every now and then to have some wild turkey, that loved even to serve frog legs, all that members have caught and brought in to our fellowship dinners. And so then, this younger black female from North Carolina came, and she came to this evangelism event called the Wild Game Dinner. And one of our elders was so excited because he wanted to have as a raffle-off item a muzzle loader, a front-loading gun. Because everybody hunted there. And it was something that people passed down to their children. Even so much so that there were prom dresses that had camouflage and pink lace around them. I even have a couple of pictures of parishioners with those such prom dresses. But part of what I had to do is to remember that this was a part of their culture, and to even begin to come out of my own fear of what that meant for me to support it. I knew that we we couldn't raffle off a muzzleloader. I knew that the society and country had just come through Sandy Hook, and they knew that they had to have a different vision of what is truly violence and guns, and have a different experience. And so we prayed and we came together. And one of the things that we decided to do is not to raffle off a muzzleloader, but to take the experience and the culture and honor the culture there in Western Pennsylvania. And instead of doing that, to invite the local con-spice person in, that's the spice group, to come in and teach people how to process their own deer meat and give them the meat grinders in which to do so and raffle them off. And then what did that lead to? That led to it in such a way that we then began to have an anti-hunger program at the church and talked about how families could be empowered. And then that led to also having more conversation about this rural and city divide, in which some places guns are looked at as this way of providing culture and familiar experience, and then in other ways, if they are looked at as ways in which people kill off those who are not like them. So we had different dialogues as well as engaging in a different type of advocacy, because that which was invisible was made visible, and that which is often not confronted was then confronted in such a way that there were racial conversations, there were conversations about child hunger, and it continues today at the church. So we have to make visible that which is invisible. But the other thing that we have to do is we actually have to connect people with the percentages. Yes, there are wonderful ways in which we use our data. But what I get from senators when we go and meet with them, and how I hear from state legislators, is that there has to be a way that we teach the people in our pews, in our faith communities, how to tell their story and not be ashamed. When we were at the Richmond payday hearing with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, there was a woman that got up with tears in her eyes, and she got up in support of the payday industry. And she had this to say. She said, "I've worked for the state for 20 years, and I have a friend that has worked for the state for 15 years. And the only people that would give us loans weren't the banks, because they weren't even in our communities, but it was the payday lender in our community.